The Whispering Forest. A ghost story. The forest had always been there, stretching across the northern boundary of Ravens Creek like a dark sentinel. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices dropping to whispers as if the mere mention of its name might summon something unwelcome. They called it Blackwood. For generations, parents had warned their children never to venture beyond the tree line after sunset. Few questioned why. It was simply one of those unspoken rules that everyone followed. Dr. Eleanor Reed knew better than to believe in superstitions, or at least that's what she told herself as she unpacked her equipment in the small cabin on the forest's edge. A distinguished botanist specializing in rare fungi, Eleanor had come to Blackwood following reports of unusual bioluminescent mushroom species that supposedly glowed with an eerie blue light during the new moon. The scientific community had dismissed these accounts as local folklore, but Eleanor wasn't so quick to judge. After all, many revolutionary discoveries began as dismissed folklore. "You really shouldn't be staying out here alone," said Sheriff Mills, the last of the movers who had helped transport her equipment from the university. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, keys jingling nervously in his pocket. "Especially not with the anniversary coming up." "Anniversary?" Eleanor asked without looking up, more focused on carefully arranging her collection vials. 30 years since the Blackwood incident," he replied, his voice dropping. "When those 5 university students went missing. Only one came back and—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Never been right since." Eleanor finally looked up, expecting to see a smirk, waiting for the punchline to what must be the traditional scare-the-city folk routine. But Sheriff Mills's weathered face held no humor, only a deep-seated unease that made her momentarily reconsider her dismissal of local superstitions. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff," she said firmly, "but I've conducted field research in far more dangerous environments than this. Malaysian jungles, Amazonian rainforests. I even spent 6 months documenting fungi species in Siberia. I hardly think a North American temperate forest poses much threat." The sheriff nodded slowly, unconvinced. "Just stay on the marked trails. And if you hear the whispering, turn back immediately." "The whispering?" Eleanor couldn't help but ask. He tipped his hat. "Good day, Dr. Reed." After the sheriff left, Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching as his vehicle disappeared down the winding dirt road. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows from the trees, making it seem as though fingers of darkness were reaching toward her cabin. For the first time since arriving, she felt a momentary chill that had nothing to do with the autumn temperature. The first 3 days of Eleanor's expedition were uneventful. She established research plots, collected soil samples, and documented the forest's impressive biodiversity. Blackwood was indeed extraordinary, not for any supernatural reasons, but for its remarkable ecological preservation. Some of the trees must have been standing for centuries, their massive trunks wider than her arms could encircle, their canopies forming a dense ceiling that allowed only dappled sunlight to reach the forest floor. On the 4th day, Eleanor ventured deeper into the forest than before. She had plotted a course to a small valley where, according to topographic maps, a stream ran through a particularly dense section of old-growth trees. If the bioluminescent fungi existed, that damp, dark environment would be the perfect habitat. As she hiked, Eleanor noticed the forest growing quieter. The bird calls that had accompanied her on previous days faded, until only the sound of her boots crunching on fallen leaves remained. The air felt heavier, somehow thicker, as if reluctant to fill her lungs. She attributed this to the increasing density of the trees and continued on her path, consulting her GPS occasionally to ensure she remained on course. By mid-afternoon, she reached the stream. It was wider than expected, its clear waters moving silently over smooth stones. What struck Eleanor as odd was the complete absence of insects near the water. No dragonflies skimming the surface, no mosquitoes buzzing about. Just an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She set down her pack and began setting up her sampling equipment. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and Eleanor zipped her jacket higher as she worked. When a twig snapped somewhere behind her, she turned quickly, half expecting to see a deer or perhaps a fox. Instead, she saw only trees, their trunks now seeming to stand unnaturally close together, as though they had shifted position when she wasn't looking. Ridiculous, she thought. The sheriff's stories are getting to you. Determined to focus on her work, Eleanor knelt by the stream to collect water samples. As she leaned forward, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the water and froze. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, she could have sworn someone else's face had looked back at her from beneath the water's surface, a gaunt face with hollow eyes and parted lips, as if trying to speak. Eleanor jerked backward, nearly dropping her collection vial. The water rippled, and when it settled, only her own startled face stared back at her. "Get it together, Reed," she muttered to herself, forcing her racing heart to slow. "You're a scientist, not some superstitious teenager." She finished collecting her samples methodically, though her hands weren't quite steady. As she packed up her equipment, Eleanor became aware of a sound so faint she almost missed it beneath the gentle gurgle of the stream. She paused, holding her breath to listen. There it was again, a soft, indistinct sound like distant voices carried on the breeze, except there was no breeze. The forest was perfectly still. "If you hear the whispering, turn back immediately." Sheriff Mills' warning echoed in her mind. Eleanor shook her head sharply. No, it was just the stream, the wind in the trees, her imagination working overtime after hearing those ridiculous stories. Yet as she started back toward the cabin, the sensation of being watched intensified. Twice she turned suddenly, certain she would catch someone, or something, following her. Both times she saw only trees, though she couldn't shake the impression that they had moved, closing in behind her once she passed. That night, Eleanor sat at her small desk in the cabin, examining the water samples under her portable microscope. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, thick and absolute in a way she'd never experienced in the city. The absence of light pollution should have meant spectacular stars, but heavy clouds obscured the sky, promising rain by morning. The samples were fascinating. The stream water contained unusual microorganisms she couldn't immediately identify, something she'd need to document thoroughly. But as she worked, a growing sense of unease distracted her. The cabin felt different tonight, colder. Watching her, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making her jump. The old building creaked and groaned as it settled, sounds that hadn't bothered her the previous nights but now seemed charged with meaning. Eleanor rubbed her eyes, realizing she'd been staring at the same slide for 10 minutes without registering what she was seeing. "This is absurd," she told herself firmly. As if in response, a branch scraped against the cabin's roof, drawing out a long, moaning sound that resembled nothing so much as her name, drawn out into a plaintive cry, "Eleanor!" She slammed the microscope case shut and stood abruptly. This was absurd. She was a rational, educated woman who had spent countless nights alone in remote locations. One local ghost story shouldn't be affecting her this way. Yet as she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself double-checking the locks on the doors and windows, something she'd never bothered with on previous nights. She left a small lamp burning on the nightstand, telling herself it was so she could find her way to the bathroom if needed, not because the darkness suddenly seemed threatening. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with shadowy figures moving between trees and voices calling from just beyond her sight. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, Eleanor startled awake, her heart pounding. The lamp had gone out, plunging the room into darkness so complete she couldn't see her hand in front of her face. But that wasn't what had awakened her. Someone was whispering. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, a susurration of voices too faint to make out words but unmistakably human. Eleanor lay frozen, straining to identify the source. The rational part of her mind suggested wind through the trees, perhaps the start of the forecasted rain. But another part, a primal instinct she rarely acknowledged, insisted that whatever she was hearing was inside the cabin with her. "Hello?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. The whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse, expectant, as if the darkness itself was holding its breath. Eleanor fumbled for her phone on the nightstand, fingers clumsy with fear. As the screen lit up, casting a pale blue glow around the room, she saw nothing out of place. No intruder, no explanation for the whispering. The time displayed on her phone read 3:33 a.m. She used the phone's flashlight to check the cabin, All doors and windows remained locked, exactly as she'd left them. Outside, the forest loomed in impenetrable darkness. For a moment she thought she saw movement among the trees, pale shapes drifting between trunks. But when she blinked, there was nothing. "Just your imagination," she muttered, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Get a grip." Still, she didn't sleep again that night. Morning brought rain as predicted, a steady drumming on the cabin roof that should have been soothing but instead set Eleanor's teeth on edge. She'd spent the remaining hours of darkness cataloging her samples, keeping the lights blazing, and a scientific podcast playing on her phone to drown out any sounds from the forest. Over coffee, she debated her next move. The rational choice would be to continue her research as planned. The stream site had been promising, and she'd barely begun her collection work. But the memory of the whispering voices lingered, along with the sheriff's warning. In the end, professional curiosity won out over superstition. Eleanor would return to the stream, but take additional precautions, leave earlier to ensure she returned well before dark, bring her satellite phone despite the poor reception, and stick strictly to the paths she had already mapped. The rain had dwindled to a fine mist by the time she set out, equipped with waterproof gear and extra batteries for her equipment. The forest looked different in the aftermath of rain, greener, more vibrant, with water droplets clinging to leaves and catching what little sunlight penetrated the canopy. It should have been beautiful, but something about the scene struck Eleanor as artificial, like a too-perfect diorama in a natural history museum. She followed her previous day's trail, marked by subtle signs she'd left for herself, broken twigs, small cairns of stones. Yet something felt off. The distances seemed wrong somehow, landmarks appearing sooner than expected, as if the forest had compressed overnight. When Eleanor reached the stream, she found it changed as well. The water ran darker, almost black in places, and the smooth stones she'd admired were now covered in a slick, greenish-black substance that looked uncomfortably like the scum that forms on long, stagnant water. Yet the stream flowed swiftly, as clear as ever at its center. Eleanor set up her equipment with practiced efficiency, though she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Twice she spun around, certain she would catch someone standing behind her, but saw only trees. On the third such turn, she noticed something odd, a pattern to the tree placement that hadn't registered before. The oldest, largest trees formed a rough circle around the stream clearing, their positions too evenly spaced to be natural. "Interesting," she murmured, making a note in her field journal. Perhaps early settlers had planted them this way, or maybe some natural phenomenon created this unusual growth pattern. Either way, it was worth documenting. As she worked, the forest grew steadily darker, though her watch showed it was barely past noon. The clouds were thickening again, threatening more rain. Eleanor worked faster, wanting to collect as many samples as possible before the weather turned. She was kneeling by the water's edge when she first noticed the reflection, not her own, but someone standing behind her, a figure in dark clothing, face indistinct but unmistakably watching her. Eleanor gasped and whirled around. No one was there. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing strangely among the trees. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered her, but now that she was alert to it, Eleanor could feel the presence of others all around, watching, waiting. The scientific part of her brain searched for a rational explanation. Wildlife, perhaps. But what animal would stand so still, watching a human without either fleeing or approaching? She turned back to her work, determined to finish quickly and return to the cabin. As she bent over the stream again, she froze. The water's surface reflected not just her face but dozens of others, pale, spectral countenances watching her from beneath the water's surface. Some looked angry, others sad, but all had their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Eleanor scrambled backward, heart hammering against her ribs. This time when she looked around, she saw them, not clearly, but as suggestions of movement between trees, pale shapes that vanished when directly observed yet reappeared in her peripheral vision. And with them came the whispering, growing louder now, still unintelligible, but unmistakably urgent. It wasn't panic that drove Eleanor from the stream site, but a cold, rational fear. Something was very wrong here, something that defied scientific explanation. She packed her equipment with trembling hands, leaving behind several samples in her haste. As she shouldered her backpack to leave, the first drops of fresh rain began to fall, pattering through the leaves overhead. The darkness had deepened considerably, the forest now cast in a twilight gloom, though her watch insisted it was only 1:42 p.m. Eleanor pulled out her GPS to confirm her path back to the cabin, but the device showed only static, the signal lost. She swore under her breath and reached for her satellite phone instead. No signal there either. Fine. She was an experienced field researcher. She could navigate using landmarks and her compass. Except the compass was spinning wildly, the needle whirling in complete circles without settling. Eleanor stared at it in disbelief. She'd been using compasses her entire career without incident. She tapped the casing, thinking it might be damaged, but the spinning continued. "This is impossible," she muttered, trying to quell her rising fear. The whispering returned then, louder than before, seeming to come from all directions at once. This time she could almost make out words. Stay. Lost. Like us. Forever. Eleanor broke into a run, choosing the direction that looked most familiar. The rain intensified, soon soaking through her waterproof jacket. Branches whipped at her face as she ran, leaving scratches that stung in the cold air. The trail she had so carefully marked seemed to have vanished. No cairns, no broken branches, nothing to indicate which way led back to safety. After what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, Eleanor stopped, gasping for breath. She was hopelessly lost. The trees looked the same in every direction, and the darkness had deepened to the point where she needed her flashlight despite it being early afternoon. As she stood trying to get her bearings, a sound cut through the whispers and rainfall, the crack of a branch breaking underfoot. Not her foot. Eleanor spun toward the sound, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. For a brief moment, the light illuminated a figure standing between two massive oaks. A young man in outdated clothes, his face pale and drawn, eyes dark hollows in a gaunt face. "Hello," Eleanor called, voice shaking. "Can you help me? I'm lost." The figure didn't respond but turned slowly and began walking away from her, movements unnaturally fluid, as if his feet didn't quite touch the ground. Every instinct told Eleanor not to follow, to run in the opposite direction. But which direction would that be? At least the figure was moving purposefully, suggesting he knew his way through this maze-like forest. And if he was real, a local perhaps, he might lead her back to civilization. "Wait," she called, starting after him. The stranger maintained a consistent distance, never looking back yet somehow conveying the impression that he intended for her to follow. Around them, the whispering continued, now taking on a warning tone that Eleanor couldn't quite decipher. They walked for what seemed like miles, the forest growing ever darker and more tangled. Eleanor's scientific mind cataloged the abnormalities, trees that seemed to shift position when she wasn't looking directly at them, shadows that moved against the light rather than with it, and most disturbing of all, the occasional glimpse of other figures moving parallel to their path, keeping pace while remaining just out of clear sight. Eventually, they reached a clearing unlike any Eleanor had seen before. At its center stood a perfect circle of ancient trees, their massive trunks twisted into shapes that resembled writhing human forms. The ground within the circle was bare earth, without so much as a blade of grass despite the lush forest floor everywhere else. The figure stopped at the edge of this clearing and finally turned to face Eleanor fully. In the beam of her flashlight she could see him clearly now, a young man perhaps in his early 20s, wearing hiking clothes that might have been fashionable 3 decades earlier. His eyes held an unfathomable sadness, and when he spoke, his voice sounded distant, as if coming from the bottom of a well. "I'm Timothy," he said. "I'm one of the students who came here 30 years ago." Eleanor stared at him, scientific curiosity momentarily overriding her fear. "That's impossible," she said. "You'd be much older now." "I was 22 when I died here," he replied, emphasizing the past tense in a way that sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. "We all were, except for Marcus. He made it out. Marcus. The Blackwood incident." Sheriff Mills's words echoed in Eleanor's mind. Only one came back and never been right since. "You're one of the missing students," she whispered. A sad smile touched his lips. "Not missing. just never found. But you're dead? Yes, Timothy interrupted. So are many others who've entered this part of the forest over the centuries. We all made the same mistake. We heard the whispering and followed it deeper instead of turning back. The whispering around them intensified, and Eleanor became aware of shapes gathering at the edge of the clearing. Pale figures with hollow eyes, dozens of them, watching silently. With a jolt of horror, she realized they all wore clothing from different eras, hikers from recent decades, surveyors with equipment from the mid-century loggers with tools from the early 1900s, and further back settlers in colonial garb and beyond, even them figures in clothing she couldn't identify but which appeared ancient. "What is this place?" Eleanor asked, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "What's happening here?" "This forest is old," Timothy replied simply. "Older than the country, older than European settlement. The indigenous peoples knew to avoid it. But why? What makes it do this?" "It feeds," Timothy said, gesturing to the gathered spirits. "It has always fed, not just on bodies but on souls, on memories, on consciousness itself." As if in response to his words, the whispering rose to a crescendo, and Eleanor could now make out fragments of stories, explorers lost in sudden snowstorms, loggers crushed by falling trees, hikers who wandered off trails and were never seen again, indigenous peoples who once considered this place taboo and avoided it at all costs. "That's not scientifically possible," Eleanor insisted, clinging to rationality even as evidence of the impossible surrounded her. "Consciousness cannot exist without a physical brain to generate it." "Can't it?" Timothy agreed. "And yet, here we are. The forest preserves what it takes, or most of it anyway. Enough for us to remember who we were, what we lost." As he spoke, the ground beneath Eleanor's feet shifted subtly, and she looked down to see roots, impossibly thin, translucent roots, curling around her boots. When she tried to step back, she found herself unable to move. "The fungal network," Timothy continued, his form growing less substantial by the moment. "That's how it works. The mushrooms you came to study, they're not just organisms, they're conduits." Panic surged through Eleanor as the roots climbed higher, wrapping around her ankles with surprising strength. "Let me go," she gasped, struggling against their grip. "I don't want to stay here." The gathered spirits watched impassively as Eleanor fought against the roots, their expressions neither malevolent nor kind, simply watchful, as if observing a natural process as inevitable as the changing seasons. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from leaves overhead, each drop hitting the ground with unnatural loudness in the silence that had replaced the whispering. "Please," Eleanor begged, looking from Timothy to the other spirits. "Help me." "We can't," said a woman's voice from among the gathered figures. A young woman in hiking gear stepped forward, her form even less substantial than Timothy's. "We're part of it now." Another figure moved forward, an older man in a park ranger's uniform. "Have been for decades." One by one, the spirits identified themselves, a roll call of the lost stretching back through decades, centuries. The roots continued their inexorable climb up Eleanor's legs, reaching her knees now, binding her to the spot. Faced with the impossible, Eleanor's scientific mind did what it was trained to do. It analyzed, categorized, sought patterns. And in doing so, it found something the others had missed. "The fungi," she said suddenly, interrupting a spirit's introduction. "They're not just conduits, they're a network." The spirits fell silent, considering her words. "Yes," Timothy finally acknowledged. "That's how the forest connects us all." "Not just connects," Eleanor reasoned aloud, her mind racing. "Mycorrhizal networks in healthy forests facilitate communication between trees, resource sharing. What if this is a dysfunctional version of that? Not symbiotic, but parasitic." As she spoke these words, the roots around her legs loosened fractionally, as if the forest itself was startled by her insight. "The balance is wrong," Eleanor continued, following her train of thought. "In healthy forests, fungi form mutual relationships with trees. Here, something's broken that balance." The spirits exchanged glances, confusion evident in their translucent features. "What does that matter?" Timothy asked. "How does that help any of us?" "Because," Eleanor replied, the word feeling right as soon as she said it. "Systems seek equilibrium, even supernatural ones apparently." She turned her gaze to the twisted trees surrounding the clearing, addressing the forest itself. "You're sick." The roots around her legs tightened painfully, as if in anger or denial. But Eleanor pressed on, driven by a certainty she couldn't explain. "This isn't how it's supposed to work." A wind rose suddenly, whipping through the clearing with unnatural force. The spirits wavered like candle flames in a draft, their forms becoming less distinct. The trees groaned and creaked, branches thrashing as if in the grip of a storm. Eleanor could feel the forest's anger, or was it fear? "Listen to me," she said, forcing calm into her voice. "I can help you." With trembling hands, she reached into her pack and withdrew a sample container holding some of the unusual fungi she'd collected. Carefully, she opened it and held it up. "These are different from the parasitic strain. These are healthy mycelium from outside your influence zone." As she spoke, Eleanor felt the roots loosen further, allowing her to kneel. She placed the fungi sample on the bare earth of the clearing. A forest's health depends on balance, predator and prey, growth and decay, giving and taking. Somewhere along the way, you lost that balance. You began taking without giving back. For several long moments, nothing happened. The wind continued to howl around the clearing, and the roots remained wrapped around Eleanor's legs, though no longer tightening. The spirits watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. Then, gradually, the sample container sank into the earth, as if the ground itself were drawing it in. Where it disappeared, tiny blue lights began to glow, the bioluminescent fungi Eleanor had come to study. The light spread outward in a network of delicate filaments, forming patterns like constellations across the barren ground. The roots around Eleanor's legs retreated completely, slithering back into the earth. The wind died down, leaving an expectant hush in its wake. One by one, the blue filaments extended toward the spirits gathered at the edge of the clearing, reaching their feet and then climbing upward, suffusing their translucent forms with gentle light. "What's happening?" asked the ornithologist, staring in wonder as her form began to glow. "What are you doing to us?" "I'm not doing anything," Eleanor answered softly. "The forest is trying to heal itself." The fungi network continued to expand, linking each spirit to the others in a web of luminous threads. As it did, their expressions changed, fear and resignation giving way to wonder, then understanding, and finally, peace. The network reached Timothy last, encircling his feet and climbing until he too glowed with the gentle blue light. "I think I understand," he said, his voice stronger than before. "The forest never meant to trap us. It just didn't know how to let us go." "Mycorrhizal networks don't just connect trees," Eleanor said, her scientific mind still working, despite the impossible scene before her. "They communicate, transfer resources, create community, but this one became corrupted somehow, turned into something that hoarded consciousness rather than facilitated its natural return to the ecosystem." Around the clearing, the ancient twisted trees began to change. The tortured human-like forms in their trunks softened, straightened, becoming more natural. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the forest lifted like fog burning away in morning sunlight. The spirits too were changing, their forms growing at once more distinct and more ethereal. They were neither fading nor solidifying, but transforming into something else entirely, becoming part of the luminous network while retaining their individual identities. "Freedom," said the park ranger, his voice filled with quiet joy. After all this time, one by one, the spirits began to dissolve into the network of light, not vanishing but merging with it, becoming bright nodes in the expanding web. Timothy remained the longest, watching as his fellow captives found their release. "Tell them about us," he said to Eleanor. "Tell the world what happened here. Not as a ghost story, but as science, a discovery about consciousness, about ecosystems we've barely begun to understand." Eleanor could only nod, words failing her in the face of what she was witnessing. "Follow the path of light," Timothy continued. "It will lead you safely back. The forest doesn't want to harm anyone anymore." With those words, he too merged with the network, becoming a particularly bright confluence of filaments at the center of the web. The blue light pulsed once, brilliant enough to momentarily blind Eleanor, and then subsided to a gentle glow that spread throughout the forest floor in all directions. When Eleanor's vision cleared, she found herself standing alone in the clearing. The circle of twisted trees had transformed into healthy, straight trunks, surrounding a patch of earth now covered in softly glowing fungi. The oppressive darkness had lifted, revealing that it was late afternoon, not night as the former gloom had suggested. True to Timothy's word, a clear path led away from the clearing, marked by small clusters of bioluminescent mushrooms growing at regular intervals. Eleanor followed it, her mind still struggling to process everything she had witnessed. By the time she reached her cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and pink visible through gaps in the canopy that hadn't been there before. 1 week later, Eleanor sat at her desk in the university laboratory, staring at the samples she'd brought back from Blackwood. Under the microscope, the fungi appeared completely ordinary. No sign of the bioluminescence she'd witnessed, no unusual properties at all. The water samples, soil collections, even her photographs showed nothing extraordinary about the forest. If not for her detailed field notes and the vivid memory of that night in the clearing, Eleanor might have convinced herself she'd hallucinated the entire experience, a combination of isolation, local legends, and the power of suggestion. A knock at the laboratory door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Sheriff Mills standing awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hands. "Dr. Reed," he nodded in greeting. "You're back." "Sheriff?" Eleanor acknowledged, gesturing him inside. "What brings you here?" He stepped into the lab, glancing curiously at her equipment. "Just checking in. Folks in town were worried when you didn't come by before leaving. Wanted to make sure you got out okay." Eleanor hesitated, weighing her options. As a scientist, sharing an account of ghost-like spirits in sentient forests went against everything she'd built her career upon. Yet the sheriff's expression held a knowing look that suggested he wouldn't dismiss her story outright. "Did you know a student named Timothy?" she countered cautiously. "Timothy Collins," he said simply. "He was my cousin." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Your cousin? Was he there?" he asked directly. After a moment's consideration, Eleanor pulled out her field journal and slid it across the desk to him. "They all were." Sheriff Mills nodded thoughtfully, making no move to open the journal. "Are you going to tell people what happened?" The question gave Eleanor pause. She'd been wrestling with this very issue since her return. On one hand, her experience in Blackwood represented a potentially groundbreaking discovery about the nature of consciousness, ecosystems, and perhaps even life after death. On the other hand, publishing such findings without reproducible evidence would likely end her academic career. "Not yet," she finally decided. "Not until I understand it better myself." The sheriff smiled, seeming relieved. "That's probably wise. The forest is different now," Eleanor admitted. "Healed, I think." He handed back her journal and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "You should know that Marcus died yesterday," he said casually. After 30 years of nightmares and mental institutions, he finally found peace, went in his sleep with a smile on his face. After the sheriff left, Eleanor sat for a long time, thinking about connections between trees and fungi, between past and present, between the living and whatever came after. Eventually, she packed away her microscope and ordinary samples, but kept her field journal close. She would return to Blackwood, not as a detached observer, but as a participant in its newly balanced ecosystem. And at night, when the forest whispered, she would listen, not with fear, but with understanding. Science has only begun to understand the complex networks that exist in old-growth forests, how trees communicate through fungal networks, how they share resources, and how they respond to threats. Perhaps in these ancient woodland communities, there exist forms of consciousness we have yet to recognize, connections we have yet to measure, and lessons about symbiosis we have yet to learn. The line between the rational and the mysterious is thinner than we think, especially in places where human footprints have tread lightly for millennia. The end.